On today's episode of Heads and Tails, we're joined by the headmaster with the smiliest disposition in southwest London, Stephen Lehec at the helm of Kingston Grammar School. We'll hear about his views on masculinity, on the changing nature of the role of a parent, on bursary provision, balancing authority with compassion, and why he thinks we should all pay a little bit more tax. Welcome back to Heads and Tails. My name is Walter Kerr. I'm one of the two founders here at Oppidum Education. And on today's episode, we are delighted to be joined by Stephen Lehec. Stephen is the headmaster of Kingston Grammar School. Before he joined KGS, he became one of the youngest ever secondary heads in the UK when he was appointed as headmaster of Aylesbury Grammar School. Stephen believes in the transformational power of education. We're going to hear more about that today. And as he says himself, he's never stopped learning. He recently completed several pre-MBA qualifications with Harvard in the fields of finance, marketing, data, and sustainability. We'll touch upon that later too. Stephen enjoys working with charitable organizations. We're going to look at bursary support, particularly for young people with a range of needs, as well as enjoying art, live music, theatre, and he is a great sportsman too. Stephen, a great welcome to Heads and Tails.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you particularly for adding a great sportsman as opposed to just sportsman. That was very, very kind.
I've heard great things. So, Kingston Grammar School then, it's a selective private co-ed secondary school in southwest London. That's where I'm from. Big contender in the kind of London day market. It's got pedigree, founded in the 16th century, I think, with the motto, work well and be happy. This podcast is listened to by lots of young teachers coming into the industry, and rarely do you get a chance to go kind of behind the curtain of the school. So I guess to kick things off, what makes KGS a successful school, and what are you focused on right now?
So, big question. To start off with the idea of a young teacher kind of coming into the school, what are they looking for? What are they going to get? They should be aware that I always ask a key question. You know, once you've been through the whole interview process of passing every test and tribulation that's thrown your way, I will always say, well, you know, do you actually love your subject, your area of interest, and do you actually like children? Which is such an obvious point, such an obvious kind of correlation for working in school. But it's amazing how many times you get one and the other and not both. But in terms of what they will get from KGS, you know, the stuff that really trips off the tongue is this, leading co-education independent day school in London, But that could describe so many schools across this area. So it's a real hotbed of independent and successful education. We have the academic success, which is great. There's huge academic pedigree in this area. Ours goes back quite a long way, so we're really happy with that. We're doing well, the well-being. But again, you know, what school doesn't want to look after its children? But we do a lot. We set a lot of store by engagement. So it's not just looking after well-being by wrapping people up in cotton wool. It's more well-being through sport, art, music, drama, lots of soft skills, public speaking. But we also had a layer of charitable service. So we try and add a culture of service. So what maybe makes us different from the competition, or a school that might attract some students, parents, and certainly some staff, as opposed to others, is you're going to work with some really aspirational children who, you know, are looking after themselves, their own personal well-being and their friendship. The whole concept of Beni Ageri Aklatari, or work well and be happy, is incredibly important. Everybody lives the motto every single day. It's not just hung above a door somewhere for people to touch in and out on. It's something they really live by day to day. But you're also going to work with lots of children who understand the concept of giving back. The privileged education means that they've got a responsibility to do something with their education, their lives, and all the opportunities they've been given.
Bursary provision then, I mean, as a head, you're sort of managing so many different things at once, particularly in this climate. You have VAT, you have enrollment numbers, you have the rise of so-called toxic masculinity. Is bursary provision sort of top of the worry list for Stephen, or is there something else perhaps more more pressing?
Maybe top of the worry list was when that coming in and how that would affect things, because we want independent education to be affordable. And that does make it, you know, more affordable for more people. So we wanted to share the burden of that with our parents. So we went a 10-10 split, you know, pass 10% on, freeze fees other than VAT, and we absorb 10%. We did that by virtue of increasing the student numbers. But you're right, the knock-on impact of that, of going from 800 then to 900, and by next year will be 1,000 students. You know, you're going to grow as a school, you get that volume, which is great. But then you say, well, if 10% of our students should be on bursaries, we've got to go from 80 to 90 to 100 bursaries. Where are you going to get that money from? But to me, it's incredibly important. It's close to my heart to make sure you're giving not just education opportunities, but life-changing opportunities to people to access the school who have got gifts, talents, who are going to go out and do great things in the world. So, we lean heavily on our alumni in terms of donations, as well as some other resources. But we try and make sure that, we maintain a high level of bursary provision as well as the odd scholarship here and there to attract people who are going to add to the rich tapestry of the school life, as opposed to just being a school for a certain type of person. In fact, I think we're probably one of the most diverse schools in London, let alone Southwest London.
Hmm. I suppose one of the challenges to that VAT decision made by the government was a kind of causation in decreasing bursary provision. But it sounds like KGS, if I can call it that, have managed to combine both a kind of quick-footed approach to VAT for parents and keeping them engaged in the school, and also keeping that at the forefront of your responsibility. For those who are listening to this, Stephen is in a well-lit, very well-furnished room, high ceilings, uh, dare I say, sunny disposition, massive smile. Um, I wanted to ask about your leadership. Is there an anecdote from either Aylesbury or now with you at Kingston Grammar School that kind of defines your style of leadership?
Well, maybe something that spans across the three schools I've worked in. So I had a really brilliant start to my career, 12 years in Maidstone Grammar School. Then, as you say, became head, one of the youngest heads in the country at Aylesbury Grammar School. And now on to Kingston. So I did 12 years, then 8 years at Aylesbury, and now I'm 11 years in at Kingston. So there's kind of a pattern there around a decade in each school. And the thing that links them all is that people who I taught in my very first few years at Maidstone, they were A-level students and I was a young teacher coming in. They're now sending their children to Kingston Grammar School. So they've obviously graduated in life, having children of their own. Again, right, that guy, I remember him. He was a good teacher. I liked him. He was my form tutor. So they're now working for the Bank of England, The Economist, international trade, finance, law. And so they're sending their children to me. And I feel a huge sense of responsibility, probably more so than I did when I was educating them, when I was young and footloose and fancy free. So in terms of my style, I think what they tell me, and the same would apply to people that I went to school with, who are now sending their children here. And they say, do you remember me? We were in the same year, or I was in your sister's year. Is that there's a sense of bespoke compassion. There's a sense of everyone gets looked after, everybody's known. I learn every student's name. I know everybody as they walk in the gates in the morning. I teach every first year when they come into the school. So I know who they are. I know their name. I know, what they're interested in. Obviously that changes as they go to the school, not their name, their interests. But that sense of, I know where we come from and I know what kind of person he is. And if I know what he was like as a teacher and as a person growing up, then I know what he's going to be like as a head. He's going to be that compassionate leader who knows people, cares about people, and will take a real interest whether you're having a huge success or a bump in the road. So my leadership style is centered around, I think, being very, very personable, very approachable, very accessible, but also that sense of treating everyone else like they are genuine individuals, not just a conglomerate mass of students and parents.
It clearly works because you have a brilliant teaching staff, many of whom who I know. Bespoke compassion, I can see. How does that sit or marry up with the authority needed to make hard decisions, to seek the best from their students? Can you have, it's not Jekyll and Hyde, but can you have a real kind of authoritarian approach, dare I say, with a compassionate attitude and leadership?
I think so. It's that classic thing that parents will recognize. If you tell a child, whether they're your own child or they're a student in your school, that you're angry with them, you create some kind of shutdown. It's kind of some kind of oppositional, kind of confrontational situation. If you say, "I'm very disappointed in you," wow, they start welling up. They're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and that's kind of how we deal with things. Yes, we have to occasionally deal with problems. Very few, I have to say, I was telling some visitors this morning to the school, and they were amazed when they saw break time, lunchtime, saying, it's very calm, it's very quiet, there's lots of laughter. And you're thinking, almost too good to be true. Everyone was obviously on best behavior. But if I have to be authoritarian, It's more about the fact I'm disappointed that somebody hasn't lived up to my expectations or our shared expectations. I don't lose my temper. It's just simply not in my makeup. But I will say to people that that's not what I expected from you, and that's often far better way of achieving a good resolution.
Yeah. Let's talk about the makeup then in terms of viewpoints. So one of the wonderful things about doing this podcast with, like yourself, great leaders in education is the variety of often controversial views that they share, they disagree, they challenge on. We've had thoughts on too many exams, not enough, too much private education, too elitist, it's beneficial. We've had phones to be scrapped, phones to be better understood. Um,
Yeah.
I'm going to challenge the sunny disposition that is flowing through this episode. Can you share, Stephen, an unpopular opinion that you're proud to hold?
Okay. This might genuinely shock, but it is different probably to the ones you've described. I don't think we pay enough tax in this country. And that may seem at odds with the whole concept of VAT on school fees, but I'll work my way back to this just briefly, if I may. Given the level of educational quality we want in this country, the level of NHS care, medical care, and social care, we simply do not pay enough for the standard we want to achieve. There simply isn't enough money in the pot. If you look at the education spending, differs between 40 to 80 billion a year, depending on what you include in education. The NHS 200 billion a year, social care very low, about 40 billion a year. There's simply not enough money in the pot. We ought to judge ourselves by Scandinavian standards, where the cost of living is much higher, but the cost of care and quality is a lot higher. But then if you decide to opt into private services, private social care, private medical care, private education, you ought to receive a tax break because you're removing that responsibility from the state. So I believe, and this is going to be deeply unpopular with people outside of independent education, I think if you're paying for private schooling, you ought to get a tax break, not have VAT on fees. But I think as a society, we should pay more tax, um, more pence on the pound, to basically get the society that we'd like to live in.
It's wonderful, and I'm keen to stick on that. I don't know if it's controversial or not. We'll see what the comments come back with. But we're on funding, and thank you for sharing that. I suppose one of the things that KGS is known for is the arts. The Queen Elizabeth Centre, the Michael Frayn Theatre are spectacular. You yourself are too modest to say, but I think there's an acting background in you. Many of the best mentors we have come from acting backgrounds. There is simultaneously, I think, a declining investment in the arts. If you look at the Arts Council, there's been a real terms cut of about 15% in the last 8 years. Here we are on funding. If you were Bridget Phillipson, Rachel Reeves, or whoever, where would you channel the money into which particular kind of areas of education do you think?
So I think you've got to look at two particular angles. I think you've got to look at the early years provision because so many children get a poor start. And with a poor start around care, diet, focus, I think you have to make sure there's high level of provision for the youngest people in our society to make sure they go from that nurturing domestic environment where the parents have to go back to work, that they go into a really sound setting and they're really well cared for and developed, so they're ready to start school. Then I think aside from, and there's often a big focus on STEM subjects and, particularly sometimes with girls having to be scientists because heaven forbid they should be artists or linguists, and follow what are considered stereotypes, or on boys doing certain things because they're certain masculine pursuits. I think avoid all of the pigeonholing and actually say we should get everybody to be exploring themselves as an artist, as a performer, as a potential singer. Everyone's got a voice of some description, choirs, public performances, because that develops confidence. And that confidence then eradicates a lot of the resistance you get where people feel boxed into a corner about who they are. So I would channel funding to two areas. Really great starts in life for the youngest people entering the early years provision in education. And from the age of 5 upwards, making sure there's dedicated time and expertise around performance of some description so that everybody can express themselves.
Beautiful. There's a lovely charity that we work closely with called Magic Breakfast, which provides breakfast for young people, and definitely check that out for those listening. We're coming to the sort of middling back end of this podcast, and I touched upon it right to the top, and you mentioned it just now. Um, it's a co-ed school, your school, and therefore there are challenges with girls and boys. But masculinity, as it happens, is in the news right now. It's in vogue, rightly so. Challenges persist with both, but obviously adolescence and other things have caused further interest in masculinity. I don't want to overplay its importance or underplay it. I'm just keen to hear your view on it. How do you tackle masculinity at KGS?
Well, I think what we forget is, and it's particularly, and again, I would never knock any type of education establishment or group, but because in British society we've been used to for so long saying that here are the boys and here are the girls. We forget that actually it's a broad spectrum of types of people with a huge amount of overlap. And actually when you then looking at masculinity, when looking at boys and young men, actually there's a huge spectrum of types. There are some very tender, softly spoken types, and some very testosterone fueled aggressive type, and some of that is born of nature and some born of nurture. um, but when you're looking at those kind of toxic elements, I think it's about conversation and I think it's about education. So I would want everybody who's at the spectrum of being, not quite sure of themselves and maybe feeling like they're hidden away, to say again that performer element. Let's get people out there. Let's get people being challenged to step beyond their comfort zone, to sing, to perform, to engage. But at the top end, often that toxic masculinity is born of being pigeonholed by other people. You are a boy. Boys will be boys. You have to play male sport. You have to do these subjects. And I think I would challenge that in exactly the same way. Step out of your comfort zone. Do things that actually make you less of what people tell you need to be. So engage with lots of different sports and activities, but also engage with things that make you uncomfortable. Engage with things with people who maybe you wouldn't normally speak to. That happens naturally within a co-ed environment. The boys, the girls competing with each other, but also socializing together. Parties aren't boys' parties and girls' parties and people trying to show off to each other. They're just groups of friends hanging out together. So I think that the societal elements of toxic masculinity could be fixed by challenging people to do different things in different ways, but also to not follow the established routes of what's expected of them.
Hmm. I'm going to come to a sort of advisory question or an opportunity to give some advice at the end, and perhaps to zoom in a little bit. But just one final question before those two. There are lots of parents who listen to this, and they do so because they're eager in the views and opinions of leaders like yourself. I, I'm I'm going to ask an interesting, I hope, question, which is around the role of the parent, particularly post-COVID, particularly in a much more kind of connected society. Have you seen the role of a parent change in their relationship with the school? Is it becoming too commoditized? Are they too involved? Are they not involved enough? What's your reflection of that?
I think what's happened, particularly in independent education, is become a lot more transactional. I think people, and understandably, and this is with the onset of VAT as well, of people genuinely and rightfully so wanting good bang for their buck. And actually, if they don't feel they're getting it, they're prepared to move. In the same way if you were buying something for for dinner that you didn't like the taste of, then you're going to go and buy something different for dinner. And it's strange that again in the UK we're so wedded to, well, I've sent my child there. No matter what's going wrong, I've got to have faith in it. I kind of made a decision. I've got to stick to it. But you can change. You can move schools. You can challenge the quality of delivery. So I think there's more transactional kind of elements to it, and I think that's fair. I think what hasn't changed and shouldn't change is the kind of tripartite relationship. Sometimes you get the parents, will say, right, it's the school's decision, we'll live with it, or my child wants this, we'll live with it. But I think the best outcomes for every child, every student, is where the child has a voice, but it's not a lone voice that has to be listened to at all costs. The parents had a voice, but equally that has to be balanced against their child's voice, because the child might want to do something that the parents, weren't expecting or don't necessarily approve of in the first instance. I challenged my daughter, my eldest, when she wanted to do A-level drama. I did that very typical parental thing of, well, what's that going to do for you? That's a great subject and I love it. And I would have done it if I was your age, but why are you doing it? And she said, why do you care why I'm doing it? I love drama A-level. I'm going to do well in it. And it's what I want to study. So I got kind of had to, I got told off by my teenage daughter at the time who told me to back off and she did do well. But you've also got to listen to that teacher voice of, we think this would be good for you. We think this would help. So I think as long as there's balance in that relationship between, the young person, the parents, and the school, then I think that's healthy. If one element of those three begins to dominate the conversation, then that can be dangerous. And maybe one of the things we've tipped into is that we listen a little bit too much to one party or another because we're abrogating responsibility to them. And I think we should avoid that.
Lovely. Well, then to finish then, I mean, you've been told off by your daughter for giving advice. I dare
Yeah.
say you won't be told off from giving advice to our listeners. So 20 years or 20 plus years as heads of secondary schools, you must have some advice. So for someone developing a career in education, what advice, Stephen, would you give them?
I think my best advice, and I do get asked this in a number of different ways, as you can imagine. Kind of okay, so if I want to follow in your footsteps or have something, what would you say? The simple answer is say yes. It's really simple, but I think there's a lot now of people saying, "Let me think about it," or "I don't think I've got capacity," or the bandwidth to deal with this, or "What if I do it but don't like it?" I think the very simple answer in life is to say yes, give something a go. Obviously, not to things that are harmful or damaging, but to opportunities, to interests, to again going back to stepping outside your comfort zone, taking responsibility. Sometimes my answer to things is what's the worst that can happen? And I will have this talk with my senior team all the time. If you try something, if you say yes, what's the worst that can happen? And if actually the worst that can happen is we reflect in a few weeks, few months' time and say, actually, that didn't work or we could do it better, then at least you've tried. And I think to every young teacher, everybody developing their career, everybody who wants to embark on a career in education, look for those opportunities. Say yes to yourself, say yes to other people. If you don't like it, at least you can say, I tried and I'm sorry, it's just not working. But if you don't say yes, they'll never ask you again.
Wonderful. Well, on that happy note, I've taken from this a man with, as you said, bespoke compassion, positivity, but also a ruthlessly clear understanding of what you think important, from arts investment to more tax to the way in which you approach femininity and masculinity, and being ruthlessly clear on that is intoxicating and something for me to take from you. I will just finish with then the point you raised, which is around legacy, and for students to follow you in education and to check in with you and see where you are must make the job incredibly fulfilling. So from me, continue to continue to change lives. And Stephen, thank you very much for appearing on this episode of Heads and Tails.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Thank you.